So my paper is kind of a riff on another paper which is coming out in a special issue. I just wanted to say a couple words about that. And this is a cooperation that I did with Professor Frey, Mathilde Frey. My father was part of it, Dr. Davidson, a bunch of other scholars like Tamara Eskenazi, Carol Fontaine, Carol Myers. We cooperated on reimagining Genesis 3:16 in a way that is redemptive for women rather than oppressive. So I want to invite you to really check out this special issue. Everything is out. It's out. It's online. It's open access. You can access it for free. Just look up Eve's Curse, redemptive readings of Genesis 3:16. And this paper is a kind of small part of the one that I published in there. If you want more information about the special issue, please let me know, and please disseminate this wonderful new knowledge all over the world, wherever you are. Okay, so the title is originally Were Adam and Eve Free? A Levinasian reading of the creation story. I'm actually going to focus only on Adam, since we already have a wonderful exposition of Eve. So I narrowed it down to Adam. And it's unusual that a woman is now speaking of a male character. Usually it's the opposite, right? We have a lot of men speaking about the female characters. This time I will flip it, and I will inflict upon you my feminine reading of the character of Adam. So please forgive me. So let us start with the notion of freedom. In our Western context, freedom is doing what I want, right? We saw this during COVID vividly, right? I want to wear what I want. I don't want the government telling me what to put on my face, right? I want to be able to meet whenever I want to with whoever I want to. I don't want to take this vaccine if I don't want to take this vaccine, right? We saw a very huge blossoming of this American concept of freedom as doing what I want, right? This is how we see freedom. We don't see, in other words, freedom is the ability to exercise my agency without limitation. Now, as we get into the biblical text, we see a very different worldview, one which is extremely anti-American, right? In fact, the biblical text seems to be full of prohibitions. It's one of the texts which seems to love limitation to the excess. And so as we get into the text and get into this original story of Adam and Eve and the tree and the Garden of Eden, we see that right from the start, in the very fiber of the cosmos, God has put limitation. And so I want to explore this story and see what it has to do with freedom, because it does have something to do with freedom. And I want to explore it through the character of Adam. And I want to read this whole story through a Levinasian lens, through the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. So let us turn there now. So we all know the story. There's a garden. God creates a man and puts him in the garden and then tells him, you will take care of this garden. And so man has just been given these kind of royal powers to take care of the garden, to rule over the garden, and all of a sudden, right in the middle, God does something which profoundly wounds this newfound power of Adam. He puts a tree, and he tells the man, you will not eat of it. And let us be clear that he says this to the man. The woman is not yet in this story, and he says it in the way that it's clearly addressed to the man as a male being. So the man receives from the onset, he has just been given infinite powers of rulership over the garden, but immediately then God curbs it and says, limitation. From that tree, you shall not eat. And I remember a colleague saying, God is not really playing fair, right? Here he has everything, right? He puts the tree not on the edge somewhere. No, he puts the tree in the middle of the garden, right? As though he is kind of, really telling man, right? Don't eat of that one, that big tree right in the middle, which you will see every day. Do not eat of that one. What is God, right? What is he playing at here, right? Why is he on purpose seems to be, in a way, instigating the man's failure, right? He's not, if I had been God, personally, I would have put the tree somewhere in the back, right? In the backyard of the garden. But no, God puts it in the middle, as though he's kind of, not even testing, but do you have smaller siblings or older siblings that are constantly trying to irritate you? Yes, do you know this? My father was my older sibling, so he would run around teasing me until I screamed. So this is kind of the same, it's kind of an irritating thing taunting thing that God seems to be doing by putting that tree right in the middle of the garden. And of course, predictably, right? Meaning, given that God has instigated this, predictably, of course, the tree gets eaten up eventually, right? So we have this tree. Now, I want to go a little deeper into what it signifies for the man to be in this garden, because we are thinking of him as a kind of a botanist, but he's much more than that. In the ancient Near East, the garden was considered, especially in the context of Persia and Sumeria, it was considered to be the dwelling of the gods. So I think John Walton has written a little bit on this notion that the garden is in fact a sacred space where God was supposed to dwell. In fact, all of the ancient Near Eastern kings had gardens, right? They had these pyramids that they were ziggurats that they would build, and then they would have a garden, a royal garden with all kinds of plants, exotic plants and animals. And the king was considered to be the tender of the garden. So he, in a way, was considered to be the one who protected the space where the divine was supposed to dwell. So we have here a precursor of the Temple of Jerusalem. Right? This is a space where God and humanity meet in this garden. And so the king's role is incredibly important. He is the one who is making it possible or hospitable to God so that this connection between the divine and the human endures. So when Adam is put in the garden, in light of this, we know that Adam is given a royal task. He's like a king, supposed to rule, protect the divine dwelling, and make sure, almost a priestly role, of connecting heaven and earth. That is the role of the ancient Near Eastern kings. And so we are, of course, right away intrigued. He's made king, he's enthroned king, and yet at the moment where he's about to deploy his royal powers, limitation. So I want to explore this limitation through the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. So let us go there now. So for those of us who know Emmanuel Levinas, we know that he is philosophizing against the backdrop of the Holocaust, right? And his main contribution is a critique of the Cartesian, modern, European, Western subject, right? This subject, which is considered to be rational subject, right? The self or man is, I think Aristotle said that, man is a rational animal. And what makes us human, what makes us more dignified than the animals, is this ability we have to reason. And Levinas is looking at this human subject whose only ability is to reason, and he realizes with the rest of us that such a subject cannot curtail, cannot curb the tide of evil that was going to sweep Europe at the time of the Holocaust. Such a subject is impotent, in fact, when it comes to facing off with radical evil. And so Levinas is going to try to weave or create and bring to the fore a new type of subject, which is this time a relational subject. In other words, man is not a rational animal for Levinas anymore. Man is a relational animal, right? And that is what he's going to explore. What makes us dignified, higher, and better than the rest of the universe. I mean, maybe not better, but what constitutes our dignity as human beings is our ability to relate. And there's a deep connection here between our ability to relate and our freedom. So let us take a look. According to Levinas, we are created originally, our natural nature, default nature, is a nature which he calls enjoyment. In enjoyment, this is the child nature. And we all have it kind of, and some of us never outgrow it, right? The enjoyment nature is the nature where I take what is needed to feed myself. So I go in the world taking, right? The takers. And as a child, it's normal to be like this. This is necessary, right? I need to nourish myself. I need to grow. I need to strengthen myself. This is a child mentality. Sadly, a lot of us, we continue even in adulthood with taking, right? We continue to take. We never outgrow the child mentality or the enjoyment mentality. And Levinas goes on to say then that the only way out of this, what he calls prison of the self, limited awareness of the world, is the interruption of the other on the self, where the other all of a sudden is saying, hey, give me that, right? So you have siblings, you know, you're over here playing, you know, you're happy. All of a sudden the other comes across and says, hey, give me that, and he takes it right from you. And now you are suffering and this is unjust and you cannot believe what just happened, right? So the only way we can outgrow basically this kind of taker mentality is if the other pushes us aside and wants and lays a claim on the same thing that we want. This is the typical scenario. You're watching a movie, someone comes in, he wants to watch something else. How dare how dare they want to watch something else, right? So Levinas says at that point, however painful it is and unjust it feels, there's an opportunity. And Levinas calls that the opportunity of breaking free out of the prison of the self. At that moment, yes, your powers are curbed. Yes, you don't do what you want anymore. Yes, you're going to take something you want and give it to the other with difficulty. But at that moment, there's an incredible opportunity that you break free. Notice my language, that you break free out of the prison of the self. And with this, Levinas is giving us a radically new definition of freedom. Freedom is not doing what I want. That's a child version of freedom. Immature version of freedom, I'm doing what I want, I'm taking what I want. Mature freedom is I am breaking free out of the prison of myself. I am expanding my universe now. Yes, I'm giving you, I'm sharing, I have less, right? But I have you now, right? I have expanded my world. I have less resources, but I have expanded my world to include you. And now I am truly, says Levinas, free, right? So very different definition of freedom. Let's look at what he says here. I'll give you one quote so you can meditate on that one. So this is from Totality and Infinity. He says this: thus, in expression, the being that imposes itself, so that person who takes what you want, the being that imposes itself does not limit, but promotes my freedom. So we think they're limiting me right now, right? But actually what they're doing, if we take the opportunity and open up and share that world, they're promoting my freedom. They're freeing me from myself. Continues, by arousing my goodness, right? So we are reminded here of Plato, right? For Plato, the highest form of knowledge is goodness. Levinas is going to move this on the existential plane and says the highest form of existence is to live in the light of the good, is to expand my universe, right? That is what it means, right? For Plato, remember, the highest intuition is the intuition of the good. For Levinas, the highest form of existence is the life of a life which is inspired by goodness, right? So you see how Levinas is moving, he's kind of shifting planes, right? From the conceptual plane of Plato, he's moving into the existential plane. He does this all the time. So he continues. The order of responsibility, where the gravity of ineluctable being freezes all laughter, and this is the key, is also the order where my freedom is ineluctably invoked. And now here's an interesting quote. It is thus the irremissible weight of being that gives rise to my freedom. The weight of being, which is supposed to weigh me down. Remember, Plato said this in the Apology, right? When Socrates is about to die, he says, at last, I will be freed from the prison of my being, from my body, right? The weight of being, I'm going to be free. And Levinas is saying, no, freedom is to be lived inside the irremissible weight of being. It is as we engage with the weight of being, as we respond to the weight of being, meaning as we respond to life, to the embodied, as we respond to the people around us, as we respond to this material life and the material needs of others, this is when I am free, not by escaping it, right? That's what he means here. Okay, so a little a moment with Levinas. So, summary, right? To conclude with regards to what Levinas is saying, and then we'll come back to Adam Victory. So, basically what Levinas is saying here, and it's interesting, I just want to really emphasize that. Levinas is not saying you should help other people, right? He's saying, he's not doing, his philosophy is not prescriptive. He's not a moral philosopher. Levinas is a phenomenologist, meaning he's describing reality. And what he's describing here is what it looks like when you decide to share the world. He's not saying you should share the world. I love that about Levinas. He's never saying that. He's saying, listen, if you share the world, this is the opportunity. This is how you will expand. This is how you will grow. Thereby, finally, giving perhaps an incentive why I should share the world, right? I should want to share the world because it constitutes an expansion of myself. It brings me to the fullness of my being. We have here a concept of freedom, which has to do with spreading my wings, becoming fully myself, expanding my consciousness to include the other. We're very close here, perhaps, to Spinoza, right? Who talks about the perseverance in being. We sometimes misunderstand him, but that's his view of freedom for Spinoza is enlarged action. The more empowered I am, the more I am able to act in the world, the more scope I have for my action, the more free or blissful I am according to Spinoza. It's the same idea here in Levinas. The more my scope of action, or simply my scope, my awareness of the world expands through the inclusion of the other, the more free I become. So, okay, so now we have this interesting definition of freedom as limitation, right? Basically, it is through limitation that I become completely free. Now we can go back to the Genesis story and see what God is up to, right? Why is God putting limitation in the garden? Perhaps in order to teach Adam true freedom, what it means to truly reign. Let's talk about the rule of man for a little bit. This is very interesting. What man is learning in the garden is that to truly be king, he needs limitation. That is the essence of the king. The king is there. The king rules by acknowledging that there are limitations on his power, thereby making room for everything else in the universe. That's the role of the true king, of the shepherd king, right? As the ancient Near Eastern kings were often called, shepherd kings, right? They were meant to rule in a way that, of course, curbs their own power in order to make room for the existence and the life forms, every kind of life form in their kingdom, animal, woman, child, a peasant, intellectual, whatever. That was the role of the king, right? Was to, in fact, exercise limitation for the sake of the other. In fact, every single king in the ancient Near East is associated with limitation. They're given in Sumer what is called the Meh, which is the set of laws, right? In Egypt, they have the Ma'at, which is also this limitation. In ancient Israel, they have the Torah, the king, if you recall, and when he is enthroned, he's not given a crown, he's given the book of the Torah, right? That is what he's supposed to meditate at night, right? The king is intrinsically associated with limitation in the ancient Near East, with the curbing of the will to power, the curbing of this urge to control everything and to rule over and to possess everything. The true king is the one who contracts himself in order to allow for all life forms to breathe, to exist, to be empowered, right? So it's interesting because the shepherd king is contrasted in Sumerian literature with the farmer. We have a scene with Inanna where she's to be married, and she prefers the farmer who's wealthy and has all kinds of things for himself, but then she's kind of advised to marry the shepherd, right? There's this notion of the shepherd king, which we find throughout the ancient Near East, and who rules by limitation. Now, this is a very interesting idea that we see here in the garden at the onset of the creation of the first king of man. We see that he's supposed to rule. His royal self is, in fact, qualified by his ability to curb himself, to limit himself. This should be very interesting now when we step a little further in the text into Genesis 3:16, where we have again the ruling of the man, right? If you recall this treacherous text, right? Her desire will be for her husband and he will rule over her. Now, maybe based on what I have been talking about so far, we can qualify what it means for the man to rule in that passage, right? We have now actually a definition of ruling in the biblical sense, right? So I'm just throwing this in your minds. Is there then not a way to reread this passage and say, okay, fine, you rule, but how? How are you supposed to rule, right? What does it mean to rule? Is it to be the farmer who acquires, or is it to be the shepherd king, right? So huge repercussions on Genesis 3:16, and also illuminating Ephesians 5, right? A lot of connections between these texts. What does it mean for the man to rule, especially in the context of gender relations? I just wanted to leave you with that thought to ponder, and I hope that you didn't mind, the men in the room, for me taking, what is it, womansplaining? Womansplaining the text to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was excellent. We have 10 minutes for questions. Yes. Here.
Thank you, David. Wonderful description. Actually, I find your paper a praise of limitation, but Actually, it seems to me that you are comparing two uncommensurable words. One of Taylor calls the polo self, that is a relational self, and also the buffer self, that is the individualist self. Sure, we can learn from one another, but there are two different worlds. My question goes in the sense, you have criticized the deformity of the unlimited freedom, but we have not criticized the deformation of the limited freedom, that this is another problem. Sure, it was not the target of your paper, but still the question remains there.
So it's not limited freedom, right? It's freedom through limitation. So the freedom is not limited. It is in fact deployed, right? In other words, what Levinas is saying is that ethics is freedom. We are free because in ethics, we deploy our powers for the sake of the other. So it's complete, there are no limits to that kind of freedom, right? And yet it is birthed out of limitation. You follow? So it's what there's no limitation there, right? It's complete deployment, infinite responsibility, says Levinas. It's infinite. You deploy it infinitely into the world. The deployment of your power, this is how you are truly free, by deploying your powers and offering them into the world, right? And that is infinite, even though it is birthed out of the limitation of what I want for the sake of the other. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you very much. It was really a fascinating talk. You mentioned that from the perspective of Levinas, we can only outgrow our childish taker mentality when something takes something from us, right? So when someone does that, this provides an opportunity for us to expand our world, and then we are truly free. But my worry is here, if the other who takes something from us is the means for our freedom, then this other person is still in the taking mentality. And if your freedom conception is relational, then this other person doesn't seem to be free. So how will the takers become free?
So it's interesting that in Levinas, I did mention the child taking the toy, but that's not how Levinas sees the other. The other never takes, the other begs, right? So it's, of course, that is, I have no responsibility towards the taker, right? But the other actually appears, inaugurates my freedom because he's not taking, he's not forcing me, but he's making me uncomfortable, right? So the other begs, you can see the other, and you can even see the taker like that as a form of begging, right? If you're compassionate enough, you can see, you're by yourself, you don't have any toys, right? You're acting, you're acting out, but there's always a begging behind the taking, and it is to that I'm responding, not to your taking, obviously not, right? And that is what moves me to offer to you, not the taking. Even in the taking, there is a begging. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you for really calling for a response and inspiring us in teach us to think. The key word there is the word no. And what is and we have a paradox here in this kind of responding to your resonating. We have a paradox. The no to freedom is yes to freedom. And what I want to add is that there is a midrash which says that midrash which is commenting on the 10 Commandments. You must have heard that, I suppose. The Torah, and there this Torah is written in the Hebrew text. It's harut. That means engraven. And as the ancient rabbis are reading this text, harut, they change the vowels, and they are free to do that because we have no vowels in the Hebrew text. It's just a consonant text. Don't read harut, which means engraven, but read herut, which means freedom. In other words, the Torah, which is engraven, which implies some kind of weight and a no is actually meaning freedom. Freedom implies a yes to freedom implies a no to freedom. So the birth of the freedom is in the no to freedom. And what's interesting is that the New Testament is also going in that James calls the Torah the law of liberty. Right? So I just wanted to read this.
Oh, sorry, this one. No, nothing to say.
So we have a question. Do you want to respond?
No, I
Okay,
don't.
so we have a question from David on the chat, correct?
Yes, David has a comment. David Barrett, thanks for the excellent presentation. I have two thoughts. First, having a limit is a check on narcissism, the belief that I alone am the world. To rule well, to be free requires moving beyond this. Second, it seems that this is not an argument against enjoyment, but for a deeper enjoyment in connection through expanding our world to include others. The narcissist must die to reveal a larger and deeper joy. In part, this is finding joy in the joy process.
And so we have two others, and then you, if we can fit for the time.
Right.
No, we're good. So,
Thank you for your passionate presentation there. It's making us reflect on freedom. So this is kind of a comment which you can do what you like with. I was just teaching on Simone Weil, and she had an interesting quote that I shared with my students that's very paradoxical that might relate to what you're saying. So she said, the most beautiful life I find is a life of pure determinism, where there is no freedom for choice. And so, I was exploring that with the students, because, right, it seems like a contradiction. But with your presentation here, it actually helps to understand what she might have meant, because as I understand, you said that limitation is the opportunity of greater freedom for ourselves, right? And opportunity of breaking free from oneself. So that opening to the other is opening to freedom, as I would put it, perhaps. So then the question would be, what happens when we open to an infinite other, i.e. God? I would suggest that's absolute freedom. Right? So I think that's what she meant, perhaps, because she's opening to the infinite other, i.e. God, and therefore she's surrendering her freedom to the absolute
I love that. Yeah.
other, and therefore she is free, right?
That's good, that's good.
And in that answer as well, might respond to a kind of the more relative kinds of question that some people were asking about, like relating to others and the limitation that human other might impose. So perhaps that third infinite other might help mitigate some of those questions in terms of the more relative limitations. So those are just some thoughts and reflections that I have.
Thanks. Yeah. Just wanted to one word about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we talk about surrendering to God, when I talk about that to my students, they're like, no, but I don't want to, it's important, my will. Levinas helps us to understand that surrendering to God, right, is in fact acquiring the biggest freedom possible, right? In a sense, it's a nice way to help people understand that.
we have Zoom. You want? Wait,
Thank you, Abi. That was beautiful, and I so appreciate it back and forth with your dad, Dr. Doukhan there. I think I captured that for a minute. But I just wanted to springboard off of what your dad said when you were talking. Well, first of all, I was thinking Heidegger was the first one who talked about man as a relational, ontologically a relational being as opposed to a rational being. And so I think Levinas maybe springboards off of that. But the context in James where we see the law of liberty, and later on he talks about the wisdom that is from above is first of all pure peaceable and willing to yield. So the context in that kind of goes to the shepherd king. You know, we have here Oleg Kostyuk. He did part of his dissertation was on the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Mark. And so there's this part there where Jesus sees that the crowds, he has compassion on them because he sees that they are sheep without a shepherd. And that notion of compassion or splagitomai is something that's used, I believe, like only Jesus. He's the only one in the New Testament that has that verb associated with him, that he or the noun of compassion. And so there's something perhaps there in the limitation that's given in the Garden of Eden as the great shepherd king is giving this limitation that there's a sense in which there is compassion. There's something that needs to be learned that can only be learned from exposure to this limitation. And anyway, these are just some thoughts that I have, but thank you.
Levinas, in fact, says that compassion is birthed out of suffering, and the suffering of limitation, of course, right? So in a way, you're right. Adam is being taught compassion, right, in order to become the ultimate shepherd king. I love it.
Thanks, Abby. Yes, I'm reflecting on this notion of kingly power as ruling within limits. I think the phrase you use is like a curbing of the will to power.
Yeah.
I think it looked at. Well, no, I mean, it's got me thinking about like, well, this curbing on the one way, I mean, it's like a reference, I think, to Nietzsche, but I think.
Doesn't mean that in Nietzsche. It doesn't mean oppression. It means like the speaker of this. It was wrong of me to use that.
Oh, no, I wasn't going to try to nitpick on that. My question was like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on curbing of power kind of as an act of self-regulation. I think you could kind of be like, I in my kingly autonomy will choose not to use this power that I have, and I will limit myself. But then you could also think about curbing as a recognition of reality, just realizing that as a finite being, I cannot. So there are just limits that I'm going to have to accept. And I think thirdly, one would be you willing to take on the limitations that others impose on you, like let's say a system of checks and balances, or saying, you know, God setting these limits that I'm going to live by. So I would just love to kind of hear your thoughts on, you know, kingly power, which of the three kind of is it that you think comes from this exchange between Levinas and self-regulation or acceptance of reality, or allowing others to set limits for you?
So what's
Yeah, so which of these three are you thinking of when you are envisioning like
which?
yeah, like yeah, limiting yourself like kingly power as an act of self-regulation,
Okay.
versus kingly power as a recognition of like limits that are there. And thirdly, like kingly power as allowing another party to actually
Gotcha.
set those limits,
Okay,
right?
okay.
And so I think kind of like, I'm just kind of wondering if, what do you think about the distinctions, and
Yeah.
which one of those three you might be thinking of when you're envisioning
Yeah.
like the shepherd system?
So I think it was you who said that Ecclesiastes is a commentary on Genesis, or was it Matilde? One of you. Okay, sorry, Matilde, was it you? Okay, all right. Anyways, in the book of Ecclesiastes, you have a spin-off on the creation story, and Adam the king. Now you have Solomon the king, right? And it's interesting because what Solomon is realizing from the onset is precisely the limitation of his infinite power. When you read Ecclesiastes 2, you have him, I did this, I possessed this, I had all the scope, and in the end, nothing, right? So the journey of Ecclesiastes, one of the ways I read it is the journey of the king, of the man king, right? And it comes, right? King Solomon really becomes truly king when he realizes, I cannot control this life. Everything is haven, right? And this is coming from the outside. He has full power. And yet, so even though he has full power in the material realm, there's still something metaphysically blocking him. And that's the moment of the birth of a true king, right? Shepherd king. King Solomon became a shepherd king only then. Before that, he was an oppressive, right? We read texts about him, he was an oppressor. In the book of Ecclesiastes, he finally encounters limitation for the first time, and at last becomes the true king of Israel, right? That's how I would be there.
That is.
So it's like an act of recognition.
Yeah.
Read my commentary, I mean,
Thank you so much, Abby, for your paper. I'm curious about, if you might elaborate on the geopolitical location of the South that needs to be limited, right? So it seems to me that the South that Levinas is talking about is precisely this European rationalized autonomous South. But I wonder, what Levinas might say, and the assumption is that this South has power, right, and therefore needs to be limited. But what about the Souths or the communities that have been disempowered by this autonomous South? And what does freedom look like for those communities within this frame?
So again, right, freedom is engendered not by someone taking from you, right? It's by recognizing the need of that other person. So it's not about, oh, okay, you took everything from me, now, yay, I'm free. It's a response out of a place, by the way, of plenitude. You first go through the stage of enjoyment, you take, you have everything, right? And now you have something to offer. So the ethics comes really from a sense of fullness, right? And I'm sharing the world. So this can be, I love the way you put it geopolitically. This idea of the relational self is everywhere except in the West. If you study any type of ancient culture, the philosophy of ancient cultures, I'm doing some study of comparison between Hebrew thought and African thought, right? In African thought, you have the self is relational. It grows through a series of relationships, the mother, the mentor, the teacher, the spouse, the children. That is the evolution of the self. Us, it's like a kindergarten, first grade, high school degree, college degree, a six-figure salary, house, white picket fence, a job. But this is how we evolve, right? It's a very different evolution. So you have this concept of the self is everywhere, right? And the West has it too, through people like Kierkegaard, Marcel. We have, a strand of it, but it's not about, right? It's not like, oh, the oppressor is saving me, right? No, because it's a response not to you're not responding to a violence, you're responding to a vulnerability you sense. And you can sense it even in the oppressor, I might venture to say, right? You can sense even in the taker that they need something, which might not be that you submit to them, right? So in that sense, right, it doesn't have to do with, bending down to the oppressor. It has to do with responding to the need of the other, even sometimes seeing beyond the oppression to the need of whoever is, fighting you right now. Perhaps. I don't know. The question, I feel it's a bit incomplete, but I did my best.
Thank you so much, Abby.
Thank you.